Good morning. My name is Bailey Yellen,
I'm Izzy Plare.
and we are both graduate coordinators at the Lehman Center for American History. The Lehman Center is a collaboration between the Rare Book and Manuscript Library and the Department of History at Columbia University. We are dedicated to supporting and enhancing the study and teaching of history here at Columbia. We want to welcome you to the first event in this new book talk series at the Lehman Center called Historians in the Archives. We created this series to stimulate conversations between scholars and graduate students about how to do the actual work of writing history. Each scholar has their own experience in the archives, and this is something that we wanted to bring to light in this series. Just on a personal note, Izzy and I are graduate students, so this is something that we're very interested in ourselves. We are delighted to welcome Professor Dan Royals to the Lehman Center. Dan Royals is an assistant professor of history at Florida International University, where he teaches courses on the United States, African American, and oral history. He's held fellowships at The Ohio State University and the Center for the Humanities at Temple University, and from the National Endowment for the Humanities. His book, To Make the Wounded Whole, African American Responses to HIV/AIDS, was published by UNC Press in September of 2020.
To Make the Wounded Whole examines grassroots responses to the disproportionate impact of HIV and AIDS on Black communities, and brings together his interests in histories of African American life and culture, public health, sexuality, social movements, and the human body. Looking at the claims that African American AIDS activists made on government institutions, private granting agencies, and AIDS service organizations, it locates their efforts to combat the deadly epidemic in the context of much longer histories of Black health activism, and the way that African Americans have framed their fight for inclusion and equality in the United States in relation to other struggles throughout the African diaspora and global South. To Make the Wounded Whole received an honorable mention of the John Boswell Prize from the Committee on LGBT History, and one of the chapters was awarded the LGBT Religious History Award. Along with To Make the Wounded Whole, Dr. Royals is conducting an oral history project among African American AIDS activists and is building an online archive of materials relating to HIV and AIDS in African American communities. We can't wait to speak with you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk with you as well.
Yes, and we're so excited to talk about this wonderful book. So since the purpose of this series is to sort of get to the bottom of what it's like to be in the archives, or in your case, to create your own archives, we thought we would start with talking about your experiences as a graduate student and how that shaped the project that we see at hand. So when you were applying to graduate school and you were talking about the dissertation project that you would maybe like to hopefully do at one point, was this the project that you had in mind while applying to grad school?
No. Short answer, no. When I was applying to grad school, I had the idea that I really wanted to write about gender and sexuality in the Cold War. My senior thesis as an undergrad was on a writer named Philip Wiley and the idea of momism, like during World War II and in the post-war period. And that's like the idea that basically American mothers were hurting the US in the Cold War by making their sons into gay communists by loving them too much, is like, you know, the is the very short distillation of that. So I had the idea that I kind of wanted to work on themes that are related in that they're kind of about the history of the body, but I was really interested in ideas of physical fitness and then how that intersects with ideas about fitness for citizenship and the fitness of the nation, you know, in kind of more abstract terms. So that was really what those were really the lines along which I was thinking. In the first couple of years of grad school, I became more interested alongside that in how ideas about race got tapped into all those conversations as well. So more interested in histories of race in the body, or, you know, race in medicine, along with sexuality in the body, sexuality in medicine. So, but yes, this is not the project that I envisioned for myself, but you know, when I think everything worked out for the better, that I ended up doing this project and not you know, what I was originally thinking about.
I mean, that's so good to hear, because I feel like for a lot of grad students, you know, they propose this project and feel a certain amount of pressure to stick with it throughout their graduate school experience. And that kind of prevents people from a certain amount of intellectual curiosity that can allow them to explore something new and maybe see that there's something really interesting in this topic that they didn't enter in with. I once had a professor who said something along the lines of, if you line up a PhD student's term papers, it's almost like a mini archive, and you can get a sense of the intellectual development through these different projects. So I'm wondering if you had any courses that really shaped this project, or relationships with professors or colleagues that were really instrumental in helping you frame this book.
Yeah, I mean, the genesis of the book came out of one of my courses. It came out of a research seminar that I took in my second year of grad school, where I set out to write about AIDS activism in Philadelphia, and then found the story of Babashi that became the first chapter of the book. Because I you know, got into archives, and I had this idea of kind of what I might find or what the stories might look like. And without fully realizing it, the stories that I expected to find were stories about white gay men. And then getting into the archive, I found this really fascinating story about the first Black AIDS service organization in the country, starting in Philly. And that really was something that came directly out of my work in archives. I found out about a collection that was held at Temple because one of the archivists there clued me into it. So object lesson there, always talk to archivists. They know the collections better than anybody. And they'll help you find stuff that you didn't even know you were looking for. So a great archivist helped me find this one collection, and digging through it, it was this, I think somebody who was an aide to, he was like the gay aide to like a local politician. And so he had, you know, there were a couple folders in the collection that were about AIDS. And one of them was, it was called, like, the title of the folder was, because I think it had just been like accessioned kind of as is, but it was like David Fair, Various Controversies. And David Fair was this like other kind of white gay politico, but one who was very closely aligned with people of color politics and labor politics in Philly. And so that was kind of my like entry into the Babashi story. But it really came, you know, kind of the way that it's supposed to, like through the stuff that I found in archives, you know, drove that iteration of the project. And then that became like, you know, the first chapter of the book. But, you know, I think in terms of like teaching and advising, you know, obviously my advisor was really important to this process. And one piece of advice, or one piece of like feedback that she gave me that I think was really instrumental in shaping, you know, not necessarily like the framework for the project, but like how I approached the project was, she would always say, like, have people do things. Like when you're writing, like put people at the center of the stories that you're telling. And so I think that comes through in the book, and that, you know, you have kind of 7 chapters that are more or less discrete stories. I think they all have kind of like, you know, one or a handful of central actors to them. I hope that those actors, you know, have some like 3-dimensionality on the page, because, you know, that's something that I thought a lot about at the writing stage. Is just like, how do you tell interesting stories? Because interesting stories are powerful stories. And yeah, I like that piece of advice is one that I have held on to, you know, for years now, because I think it's so it's so spot on in terms of, writing good history.
Yeah, I mean, you have so many people in the book who are doing things, but you also have institutions and organizations that are also doing things. And I think one of the really interesting elements of the book is about funding and how these organizations start off as grassroots. And when they get funding, especially federal funding, it kind of becomes more difficult to remain within a community and also have these federal infrastructures that they have to say what they're doing. And we were wondering, this element of public health is a really important feature of the book. And is that something that you started off with as a lens that you were going to use when thinking about activism? Or is that something that sort of developed through your research, later on?
I mean, I think it was kind of like, it's related to the interest that I came to grad school with, like the interest in the politics of the body. Like that, to me, includes public health, but public health per se wasn't necessarily my main area of interest. I came to that really in doing this research seminar project on AIDS and AIDS activism. And that, I think, I came to really through an interest in the history of sexuality, because as I conceptualized it, like that was going to be a story about predominantly white gay men in Philly. Again, like I wasn't thinking explicitly in those terms, but when I found the Babashi story and then thought about, why does this stand out so much to me? It was because my idea of like what AIDS activists were going to look like was like, it was white gay men. It was like shaped by images of ACT UP and shaped by, kind of the cultural products of the, the first couple of decades of the AIDS epidemic. So, I didn't necessarily come to it with a strong interest in public health. My interest was more, I think, in the politics of sexuality, but chasing this story and then trying to find the other stories around it, led me much deeper into histories of race and public health as well.
We were also wondering, so you finished your dissertation 2014, graduated from Temple, and then it brings us to this book in 2020. So I was wondering, if you could speak a little bit about the process of turning this dissertation into a book. How long did it take? What did it entail? And what did you have to sort of add or subtract in order to make this into what we read today?
I think it was a purely additive process. I don't think I subtracted anything. So yeah, I defended in really, my degree was conferred in early 2014, but really I defended October 2013. And then the book came out July 2020. So it was, between defense and publication, almost 7 years. During those 7 years, I was on the job market for 3. And just being really honest, that slowed down the publication process. There was a year in there where I applied. I was basically teaching and applying for jobs, and I think doing nothing else. So, not a lot got done on the book in that year. But in terms of, like revisions, the structure of the dissertation was pretty similar to the structure of the book. I mean, to go from dissertation to book, really, I fleshed out the chapters that I had and added 2 chapters. But in the dissertation, there's an introduction, there's Babashi's story, gay men of African descent story, a Nation of Islam story, and and on and on. The 2 that I added were about the National Task Force on AIDS Prevention and then Sister Love in Atlanta. So to do that, I actually had a bunch of the research done for 1 chapter, for the National Task Force chapter. The Sister Love chapter, I had to do basically all of the research during the revision, the manuscript revision process. But that chapter came out of a really kind of fortuitous meeting in 2017 that I had with Desan Dixon Diallo, who is the founder of Sister Love, who was one of the participants in a workshop that I organized at the Rockefeller Archive Center up in Tarrytown about AIDS and philanthropy. And so we convened some people who worked in the philanthropic world, some academics, and then some activists as well. And Desan was one of those. And so out of that meeting, came the Sister Love chapter. I had envisioned writing a different chapter, but meeting Desan and talking to her convinced me that this was a chapter that needed to be in the book. And my conversations with her, I'll say, also crystallized my thinking about that issue of funding and what big blocks of funding do to grassroots organizations. Because I think it was already there in the project, but talking to Desan and hearing her perspective on it kind of gave me the sense that there is something there to talk more about, and adding the Sister Love story to the book help pull some of those threads together, just by giving another story to look at them through. So,
well, we're happy that you included that chapter. It's one of my favorite chapters in the book, truly. I think there are ways in which, even though you're bringing light to a community that is oftentimes ignored when people picture who is the face of the AIDS epidemic, I think women of color especially are erased in that image. So I think that chapter is incredibly important.
Yeah, and it had to be in the book, because there are a number of Black women, key players in the book. Rashida Hassan, Prunessa Cecile, Wahida Shabazel, are important figures in the book. But outside of the Sister Love chapter, that's the chapter that is really about doing AIDS prevention specifically, deliberately among Black women in the South. So it's without that chapter, I think the book really would have been missing something important in a number of ways. And I'll say it's one of my favorite chapters too. It's also the one that I wrote last, which I think is kind of interesting. So it's the one that I wrote with kind of the most experience, and hopefully the most skill.
Yeah. Just as a side note, I study the transatlantic anti-slavery movement, and it's such a common theme throughout history that Black women are the foot soldiers of these social movements, and yet they're not understood as leaders in these movements, and also not necessarily understood as the main recipients of the work that the movement is actually performing. So I think that theme in the book is really important and speaks to a larger historical trend.
Yeah, and not just Black women doing and leading the work, but also doing and leading the work in this supranational context, right? Because they're doing so much work that crosses the Atlantic, going to South Africa, going to Tanzania, or a bunch of other countries in Prunessa Cecile's case. So one of the other things that kind of grabbed me about this set of stories was just how international and transnational they were, just how apparent it was that people were thinking in these bigger diasporic contexts in ways that I thought were really fascinating.
Yeah, the geographical expansiveness of the book is so impressive and quite surprising, actually. When I read the introduction, I was like, oh, this is going to be about South Florida, and then I'm taken to all these other locations, and it was such a pleasant surprise as a reader. Did you ever experience any pressure to maybe limit the scope and just focus on Philadelphia, for example, or just the United States? Or was this always the framework that you were working with, that this is a transnational global fight that these people are engaged in?
My advisors always pushed me to think big and be ambitious with the project. At times I wished that I thought I would have had an easier time. if I had done, say, a project on AIDS in Philly, because one of the things about writing a book that is multi-sided in this way, that has kind of, the chapters all fit within a bigger story, but they have very different kind of angles, so there's one or two that are pretty strongly about religion, and they're like, one is about the Black church and one is about the Nation of Islam, very different institutions. There's one that's about like globalization politics, and there's a couple that are very strongly about sexuality, but they're in different places. And how is San Francisco different from New York, is different from Atlanta, is different from Philly. So doing that kind of project, I'm glad that I did. At times I wanted to like beat myself over the head, because by doing that, it's like every chapter you kind of go back to zero in terms of context and historiography, which multiplies the work. But, I think in the end, it worked out really well. Like, I'm really happy with the book that we got as a result, because it does, I think, show the breadth and depth of this movement that very few people recognize as such. So, that's all kind of like caveat, but I guess, again, for like, for grad students, like, you're not alone in all of your doubts. Like, I shared many of those doubts along the way. So yeah, but the kind of geographic reach of the project was good in the end. Made things a little bit complicated along the way. Some of the archives that I had to go to over and over were, happened to be close to places that I would go anyway. I have a lot of friends. I visit San Francisco often. So it wasn't too much to, carve out some time to go to UCSF. Is it healthy to spend your vacation doing research? That's a different question. My dad lives in LA, so going to one archives was not, was kind of not terribly onerous.
So just pick location where you want to go. Just shape the book around where you want to go visit.
I mean, that is how I ended up doing a lot of early research at UCSF and the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco, honestly. Which led me to some of the stories that led me to the story of the National Task Force on AIDS Prevention. So, I went to I researched in a lot of places, not all of them close to people not all of them close to family or friends. But, it helped that was a little bit possible.
Of course. And we thought we'd sort of pivot from here to, we're so glad that you're mentioning archival sources, archival research, and so much of the work of the historian is to just, put your head down, read a lot of old books, and get it done. But we were wondering also, at what point, throughout this process, did you decide, I'm going to become an oral historian? I'm going to interview the people that I see in the archives.
It was at the point that my advisor said, so you're going to do oral histories, right? And I was like, yes. Whatever you say. And I was nervous about doing that because, our idea of like what research is put your head down in the books and hunker down and read. And doing oral history is really different. Books don't talk back to you. Books can't tell you that you're wrong. Which was really like what my fear was going to talking to people, was that I was going to, I was going to show how little I knew, or that I was, I was afraid that I was going to embarrass myself by talking to people whose stories I was trying to tell. And, that felt very high stakes to me. So, I took my advisor's advice. I went and got some training in a couple of different places. But the most important was it's now the Oral History Center at UC Berkeley. It used to be called something else, but they have a week-long intensive summer training for oral historians that I was able to use some departmental funding to go to. And that really was the most important experience for me in terms of setting me up to do this oral history project. I still made a lot of mistakes in doing that oral history project. You know, listening to my early interviews is can be a little bit like cringy, you know, because I'm more experienced now and I can just see, you know, mistakes that I made or things that I would have done differently, which is part of the learning process, right?
Yeah.
So, but it was, yeah, it was just through the encouragement of my advisor that I started to do oral histories, which, you know, went from being something that I kind of did a little bit reluctantly to one of the things that I found the most rewarding and engaging as part of the research. I can think of times when, because there were times when I had major doubts about the project. I wasn't sure if it was ever going to be done or if I could do it or, you know, anything like that. And actually interviewing people at times that I felt like that brought me back to what was important about the project, what was sustaining about the project, brought me back to feeling really good about the project. So I'm, you know, really glad in a number of ways that I was pushed to do it, because it ended up being one of my favorite things.
I wanted to pick up a bit on something that you mentioned earlier about your advisor's advice about how to tell a story, and specifically with regards to oral history and the question of voice. So you mentioned that the last chapter in Atlanta was the last one that you wrote. And I was wondering, because that's a chapter in which voice is very prominent. I was wondering when you made the choice to paraphrase, when did you choose to sort of directly quote, and how did you sort of weave that together into the story that you were trying to tell?
That's a good question, because I don't know that I don't know that it was that conscious. I think I chose to quote when it felt important for me to do so, like, you know, when it's really evocative, or when there's something about the narrative that I want to highlight in the text as being narrative, right? So when the content of an oral history or content of an interview doesn't line up with other sources, then it's really important, I think, to quote that directly, because you're highlighting it as one person's narrative. And when I ran into spots like that where, you know, where oral narrative didn't line up with the documentary record, you know, it wasn't to, I don't know, call out that people were like misremembering or whatever. That's not the point. As oral historians, when we run into situations like that, where we have sources telling different versions or even different stories, then we look at that and say, okay, what can I do with this? Or like, what is important about this? What does this disagreement tell us? And I think, you know, in a lot of cases, like, there's something productive that you can do with that. You know, what is it about somebody's subjective experience or personal experience that leads them to remember this differently from other people or from written sources? Is it, you know, is it their background? Is it their worldview? Is it, you know, the emotional experience of, you know, the incident that shapes this? You know, so, you know, there's something that we can do there with that, and that's, you know, I think a good bit of like oral history is figuring out how to interpret those dissonances.
Yeah. That reminds me of a moment in the first chapter. You're talking about one of your subjects, Rashida Hazan, and she's remembering this speech that she gave in the 80s. And she describes it as her Malcolm X speech. And then you say that you watched the recording of the speech and there wasn't the language or, you know, the tone that she remembered as presenting during that speech. And, you know, you're suggesting that in those moments as an author, there's something sort of analytically relevant in this disjuncture between memory and record. But in that you're working with people who might read the work and who might have feelings about, you suggesting that there's that they're remembering things in a different light. Like, what sorts of responsibility does that put on you as a scholar and as somebody who has formed relationships with these people through these sessions? Like, how does that make you feel? And do you feel like there's any responsibility to go back to the interviewee and say, hey, I have a different interpretation of this speech that we discussed?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I feel a lot of responsibility to tell the stories in ways that are faithful to the people who told them to me.
Mm-hmm.
My responsibility as a historian is to, look at lots of different kinds of sources, obviously, and tell a synthetic story that is more or less factually faithful. So it with that incident in the story with Rashida Hassan, there's probably like less generous ways that you could narrate that. Like if I were an author who had an axe to grind with Rashida, I could probably use that to cast doubt on her reliability as a narrator. Oh, is she like if she says this here, then how can we trust anything that she's saying? But that wasn't the point. That wasn't what I was trying to do. That wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to use that moment to think about, how did Rashida subjectively, emotionally experience this moment, what came before, and what came after.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't ever have that conversation with Rashida. I think I would have felt really weird about it, because it's such an emotional memory.
Mm-hmm.
And I know from talking to her and others that kind of for everybody around that story, it was a really difficult time. So, I would have felt, I'll say, off about going back to her and saying, well, this doesn't line up with this.
Mm-hmm.
That to me would feel like that would feel outside of the character of our relationship, which I think has been very warm. I mean, I've been in touch with her. I was in touch with her earlier this year about kind of an essay that got spun off of this for a collection on LGBTQ oral history. And so our relationship, I think, has been warm. She's been very supportive of the project. So it would have felt weird to me to go back and say, like, what you told me here and like this video, like they don't line up. Other people might disagree and argue that it would have been productive to have that conversation. I honestly don't know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I think as a kind of guiding principle throughout, I have wanted to tell, just to be kind of faithful to the people that I was writing about, while also not, putting them on a pedestal or rating hagiography. Because our part of our role as scholars is also to be critical. But you can be critical without being very sharply criticizing, obviously.
Right.
So striking that balance it is something that I have had to think about, have thought about, and I hope did a good job of.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find that people were generally excited to talk about their experiences, or was there some hesitancy? I mean, what was that initial meeting like with your interviewees, and how did you find people to interview?
I started doing interviewing for the dissertation.
Mm-hmm.
And for the dissertation, I knew there were two stories that I had very few archival records for at the time, and that I would need to do interviewing just in order to be able to write the chapters. It was the Babashi story, and that was the ACT UP Philadelphia story.
Mhm.
And so later on, actually, as I was in the process of revising the dissertation for publication, I got access to more documentary evidence just because more of it came into archives. And so I was able to look at it. But, at the outset, I thought I'm going to have almost no written records for these two stories, and especially for the ACT UP Philly story. So that's really where I focused my energy in interviewing. But, so, and as part of doing that, I used kind of a rough snowball sampling method. I interviewed Rashida first. Rashida told me other people to interview. And I know that in at least one of those cases, Rashida kind of vouching for me helped me to get in the door with some folks. And, I can't say, all I can say about that is that when I approached Rashida about doing an interview, and in the interview, I just tried to be I just tried to be an empathetic interviewer. I tried to understand where she was coming from and telegraph that I understood. Right, I just tried to be there as a sympathetic figure. And I think that helps a lot because I am also a white scholar who is interviewing mostly Black folks. And, if people were hesitant to talk with me, I can understand why. By virtue of doing this project, I can understand why. A lot of the kind of bigger story is about their engagement with white gay men in aid services who either, who were hostile, who just didn't get it, who were kind of willfully ignorant, who were, unwillfully ignorant, but just I can understand why people might have been really suspicious to entrust me with their stories. Thankfully, folks like Rashida vouched for me, and that was hugely helpful.
Yeah.
But also people were really eager just to tell stories and have them be in the record because people were very conscious of how their stories had, been written out or had not become part of this bigger story of AIDS activism in the US. At the time that I was doing most of the interviewing was the time that How to Survive a Plague, the film, came out, which is really about white gay men in a corner of ACT UP New York. That was when The Normal Heart came out. So, we were getting into what some folks, I'm thinking particularly of Ted Kerr, who's a AIDS theorist and critic, called the second AIDS crisis revisitation, which is this kind of groundswell of memorialization and remembering about AIDS history that really focused on white gay men. And so, the people that I was talking to were aware of this massive silence in the revisitation.
Yeah.
And I think probably as a result, were more willing to talk to me.
Yeah. And, there's this theme in the book of erasure and kind of the fear of one's community being wiped out by this epidemic. So I can imagine that some people would feel really gratified that their experiences and their communities and relationships were being memorialized and captured in some way.
Also, I thought that something that sort of you're bringing up here, but that really comes through in the book is how African-American activists actually drew on history themselves, like their community's history, through their activism. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that relationship between history and the movement and how you see yourself, as a historian, but sometimes activist throughout this process.
Yeah, I think that really comes through in the chapter about gay men of African descent, because a big part of their project was to kind of formulate for people a Black gay history, which in 1986 was definitely not as developed as it is now. I mean, in 1986, gay history, point blank period, was not developed in the way that it was now. There were no positions for LGBT history. We didn't actually have the acronym LGBT yet. It was gay and lesbian. But I know that a number of people who were in the field at the time could not get academic positions. So like John D'Amelio could not get an academic job and, went to the like advocacy sector as a result, and came back to the academy later on. So, I say that just to say this is a very different time in terms of the recognition of gay history in general, but Black gay history in particular. So, one of the things that groups like GMAT did was to show people, represent for people that there was a Black gay history both in the United States, in African American history, but also in African history and tradition, like on the continent. So, this is at the same time that, people were making Black nationalist claims about, that there were no gay people in Africa. This is like a European corruption. This is evidence of like subjugation in the United States and Europe. So, Black gay men were really pushing back against that, but using history as the tool to do, using really like kind of public history as the tool to do that, which as a public historian, I find really interesting. I think it goes back to that point that, stories are really powerful, and, their stories are really powerful. They're really politically powerful. I know this is something that like people in politics and organizing also talk about a lot. So, one of the kind of like fundamental skills that people try to develop as, organizers or canvassers or whatever, when you're doing really like political work, is thinking about what they call the story of self. So how are you going to talk about your personal story with, say, a voter in a way that's going to, humanize you, personalize some very big political issues, but help people to both connect with you and to understand politics in this kind of personal way. So it was really interesting to me that, in a way, gay men of African descent was doing a kind of similar thing. For me, it made that story like really, really rich and fun to write about. And I think that there is, some folks have written about, like the history of gay history. I think there's a history of Black gay history that needs to be done as well.
Yeah. I was really struck in the introduction. You start by discussing this town in South Florida, and you mentioned that this was the location of Zora Neale Hurston's book, Their Eyes Are Watching God. And that comment struck me because she is one of my personal heroes as a scholar. And it got me thinking about her work with the Federal Writers Project and sort of their mission to collect stories of individuals who have made the transition from enslavement to freedom. And I was wondering if you sort of saw yourself in this lineage of public history, and if your work in any way sort of connects to this larger effort to collect experiences from individuals who have a real story to tell, but who have been sort of ignored from the historical record for various reasons.
I hadn't thought about it in that way. I'd be a little bit reluctant to, put myself in a lineage with Zora Neale Hurston, just because that sounds like a lot. That sounds like real like self-aggrandizement. So I'll take that. I'll take that as a great compliment, I guess. No, I hadn't thought about that in exactly that way. But I think that's really interesting. And I mean, just in general, yeah, like I hope that the oral history work that I've done, the digital archiving work that I've done, I hope that gives other people the sources to write more histories, right? Like I've approached this project, you know, obviously with an eye to getting a book out, getting a dissertation done, and getting a book out, because those are the things that we need to do, like in the academy, to stay in the academy. Much less advanced just to stay here. But I've also, you know, approached the kind of corollary pieces of it with an eye to creating a foundation for other people to continue doing this kind of work, for people to write other stories. So, you know, there's interviews that I did that didn't make it into the book. You know, those will be archived. I hope that other people will use them. I think for me, as again, a white scholar doing Black history, I think it's really important for me to use the, you know, the tools at my disposal, the resources and the privilege at my disposal to do that kind of work, right? So like, not just to write a book, and I hope that the book does inspire people. Like I hope that the book is politically powerful in that way of making these stories available, but I don't, you know, want it to be just about me doing that. I want to make it possible for other people to do that as well. I think that's really ethically important for how we think about doing research across not just lines of difference, but lines of access.
Yeah.
I think it's really important for that as well.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Absolutely. And actually, I think this is something that you really touch upon, even at the beginning of the book, where you mentioned that, you know, this is a history about African American activism in the struggle against AIDS, not the history. And I thought that, you know, when you're sort of talking about this, you actually suggest some future avenues for research. So namely, you talk about activism in Black communities in the Deep South or in the Rust Belt, or local battles over needle exchange programs. And we were thinking, were there any sources that you sort of saw, whether in the archives or again, these sort of oral history interviews, where you went, someone should write a book about this? Maybe not me, but, you know, someone, just for the graduate students listening out there trying to find a topic right now. So
yeah, I mean, no specific collections are popping into mind, but I mean, UCSF and the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco and the San Francisco Public Library have all contributed to the this AIDS history project they're doing a bunch of digitization with it now too. So more stuff should be, you know, becoming more widely available. But there's tons of collections there to use. Obviously, there's a lot at the Schomburg, but also like we want to get outside of the New York, San Francisco hegemony when it comes to AIDS history. I mean, I'll say one that actually I would like to work on, but there's a group. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, based in Atlanta, you know, King's organization, like the SCLC. They had an adjunct program called SCLC Women that did early AIDS work. It's early AIDS work that was complicated because of respectability politics, because of some of the individual people that were affiliated with it. But that's a really interesting story that we don't know that much about. And the records came pretty recently to Emory. So as soon as Emory opens back up, I would like to dig into those records. But if there are any grad students at Emory who want to beat me to it, that is well within your right, and you should do that. But that's an interesting story that I would like to know more about. Yeah, I mean, we do need to know more about AIDS in the Deep South, and really, I think the Rust Belt, there's a lot there as well. One of the interviews that I recently processed was one with Dr. Vicki Cargill, who's now in the state of Maryland Department of Health. but she was in Cleveland for a while and developed a youth AIDS program in Cleveland. Just, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, we don't know that much about. Chicago's different from Cleveland to Detroit in ways that I think are kind of obvious. But just like that swath of the country, there's a significant Black population, and I know that people were doing work. We just don't know that much about it, and I'm not sure what records are available. There's got to be something, but that's another kind of dimension to this. I'm thinking specifically of the Rust Belt, that shouldn't get lost in as much as we have a lot about San Francisco, we have a lot about New York. We should have more about the Deep South, just because that's where the front line of the epidemic has been for decades. But there's lots of Black folks in the Rust Belt who have been there, who also dealt with this problem, and the story there probably looks different, especially if you bring it forward to the present day. The opioid crisis. We've seen in some communities like waves of HIV infection related to needle sharing. I mean, there's just a lot more, and I hope that people will tackle it. There's just so much. There's just so much, like, really.
Yeah.
Go for you, Bailey.
I was just going to say, at the end of the book, you very much are bringing the history that you're telling to the present day, and you're suggesting that these issues are ongoing and these dynamics that you're describing are still at play. And it just kind of got us thinking about, the current pandemic that we're living through. And I'm sure that you have been asked many times what lessons from the book can be applied to the pandemic. And I think that there are a lot of lessons from the book that could be, and that could, shape our response to the pandemic, and especially the disproportionate effect that communities of color have had from the pandemic. But we were kind of wondering, instead, if you were writing your book during the pandemic, if you were doing the research and writing the book now, how the current situation would have shaped the product of the book, and if there would have been any changes that you would have made based off of the current situation that we are living in.
I mean, the conclusion would be different, because the conclusion is about, the very end of the book is about kind of HIV and disaster, thinking about climate change through the same lens in terms of the things that make people vulnerable to disaster, whether that's epidemics or fires, floods, what have you. I'll say I turned in the final manuscript. I turned in the final manuscript, or maybe I did copy edits, was like in February, February 2020 was like when I handed over the thing. Had this gone just like, had I been off by a couple months, the conclusion might have looked really different. Although I don't know how I would have made sense of it in, say, March or April 2020. I think it would probably be different from how I make sense of it now. Although some of those things were coming into focus, pretty early on. I think, as early as late April, early May, in terms of, the vulnerability of people of color, particularly in the South. That was something that we saw pretty early on. But then certainly by May, we were seeing some of the right-wing reaction to masking, to, just kind of basic mitigation strategies, in really troubling ways. And I think, kind of the thing to pull from that and from the stories in the book is that we have to understand that health and public health are about much more than what we do as individuals, right? I mean, that's something that I want people to understand about HIV and AIDS. because it's very easy for people to think about HIV as something that you get because of something that you did that was probably wrong. Like you shot up drugs, you had unprotected sex, like, and so that's why you have HIV. And so like, in the subtext there's like, and you kind of deserve it.
Yeah.
So, and we really shouldn't think of it in that way, because there are factors that are far outside of people's control that make, the likelihood that you will contract HIV by sharing needles with somebody or by having sex with somebody much, much higher for some folks than for others.
Mm-hmm.
And, from nothing that they did. There are things that make people vulnerable to disease, whether it's HIV or COVID, that have much more to do with how much money you have, what zip code you were born into, what the color of your skin is, than anything else. And that's something that I really want people to take away from both of these epidemics, because I think we have strong evidence for that in both of these epidemics. The troubling thing is that, with both of these, there are people who are really resistant to seeing that. I think we see a lot of evidence of that with COVID, where there's an attitude that, like, it should be, some people have a really laissez-faire attitude toward it, obviously, like, well, like, you can wear a mask, but I don't have to wear a mask. It's like, but what you do affects me and all of us. Like, we are lacking that sense of a public, of a commons, of a shared project or linked fate, any of those things, in ways that are really hampering, in ways that are making the epidemic worse. I mean, so Greg Gonzalez, who's at Yale in public health, he was, involved in ACT UP New York back in the day. Actually, I think, like, got into public health through ACT UP, and then, now he, like, is in the Department of Public Health at Yale. Wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago that was like, as people are talking a lot about, okay, like, COVID is endemic now. COVID is going to be endemic. The piece was like, endemicity is a choice. It does not have to be this way.
Yeah.
But because of the choices that we have made individually, collectively, as a society, our political leaders, like, we don't have to have COVID be endemic. We are choosing to have COVID be endemic because the people that it is affecting are not people that we care about.
Right.
In one way or another. So, I think that I don't think the overall framing of the book would be different. I think I honestly would probably be politically sharper in the book if I were writing it today, or if I had written it during COVID, just because I think that my mindset would have been different. I would have been writing with all of the feelings that I had and have during COVID, which is a lot of, like, anger, frustration, despondency, that I didn't have as much when I was writing the book. And maybe it's worth it for me to think about why.
Yeah, I mean, I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this narrative that, COVID is the great equalizer and it's going to cross racial, socioeconomic divides and will impact people equally. And as we quickly learned, that was not the case, and that continues to not be the case. And I think,
and I thought that, like, yeah. I was like, okay, sure. Here we have a virus that's airborne, it's deadly, it's not, it is, I felt like it might be an equalizer, and that might be something that came out of it, was that people would have to understand disease in a different way.
Right. But that's something that's a main point of your book, that people's experiences with health and sickness is dependent on these structures that have been in place for, hundreds of years. So, I think that hopefully we can move on from this mindset that things such as COVID will make us all equal, because that sort of distracts from the fact that there are already systems in place that ensure that it won't impact people equally. And I think that's a hugely important lesson from your book.
Yeah, thanks. It's a lesson that I struggle to learn.
Really appreciate all the political urgency that goes into your work, and especially in this interview. And unfortunately, our time together is coming to a close. So we were wondering if you had any parting advice for someone trying to write a history book, whether a graduate student, whether a junior scholar, or even someone who has quite a few books behind them. But if you have a few words for us as we go.
Yeah, you know, find or build, create a community for yourself, because it can be a really isolating, lonely process. And, you know, just finding people to read your work is helpful. Finding people to talk about the process is helpful, because the things that you're feeling, which are a lot, as you're doing this, are things that probably lots of people feel. And I think it's important to recognize that, you know, the things that you're feeling in this process are not just you. And so, you know, just to have a sense of community, I think is really important.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. This is really enjoyable.
Of course.
Of course.